So let's delve into a few of the highlights for the followers of the Omni Steriliser in the new Admech Codex, talking through 7 of the biggest and most impactful rules changes that happen to be in this book. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Admech, and in this video, which is a bit of a prelude to my main Codex review, I thought I'd just stop off and talk about a few of the most major rules changes and how they might impact the faction. It's certainly been a very busy weekend with Warhammer 40k rules releases. I would have got the Codex done a little bit earlier if Necrons hadn't dropped at the same time, though I have stopped off for a couple of videos reviewing the Cohort Cybernetica and the Sidonian Skatros. Hopefully I'll aim to have the full Admech Codex review done in around about 24 hours time if everything goes to plan. Until then though, I thought we'd just go over a few of the most major strokes that haven't been seen so far, talking through a few of the altered rules and a few of the other detachments. First up, and in a very welcome change, the Rad Bombardment rule got really quite a lot better for the newly rechristened Rad Zone Cohort. Previously this rule was kind of dire, certainly ranking amongst some of the worst detachment rules in Warhammer 40k, though there are a fair few other fairly mediocre ones. Now though, they do seem to have changed it, so it's actually going to be something that the opponent is going to have to be worried about. The first turn rule, when you get to have the choice between either taking cover or standing firm. Now even if the enemy units take cover, they're still going to risk taking mortal wounds. If the unit chooses to take cover, then they do get automatically battle shocked until the end of the first battle round, but they still get the chance to take D3 mortal wounds, taking D3 on a 5+. In an enemy army with quite a lot of units into it, that could add up to some fairly good damage. Say for example, if the enemy army had 12 units set up within their deployment zone, you'd average around about 8 mortal wounds even if they all did take the battle shock. Chip damage isn't quite as helpful as focal damage, but it definitely doesn't hurt to soften the foe up a bit. In general, I still think that's usually going to be the best play for most of the opponent's units, to just take the battle shock and take slightly less damage. It's maybe most relevant for a few things like secondary objectives, or maybe the occasional thing like stratagems. As well as that, the Fallout rule has been improved slightly. In the next command phases, it now happens in your own command phase when the enemy takes Fallout in their deployment zone. And for each unit that remains there, you've got a 3+ chance to take 1 mortal wound, but also that enemy unit must test Battle Shock as well. The Battle Shock is an upgrade, but I guess given that you test it in your own command phase and not the opponent's, it does mean that you won't usually be denying them primary points, but still extra random Battle Shock going out is kind of nice to have. There's also an enhancement as well that means that this effect also persists to 6 inches out of the enemy deployment zone as well, so that's really quite a big chunk of the board there. That will make it far harder for the enemy just to tow out of their own drop zone, if they do care about taking the chip damage and the battle shock tests. Overall, quite a nice improvement. I feel like the Admech borderline didn't really have a detachment rule before, and now at least this one is going to add up to a fair few more mortal wounds than it would before. Otherwise, there have been quite a few datasheet changes, quite a few special rules tweaked around, or a few minor keywords added. These are maybe just a few of the highlights. The Scorpius Dune Rider seems to have got a bit better, I think. Getting twin linked on their stubber attacks makes them a lot more threatening against lighter infantry. They gained the smoke keyword and got to reroll wound rolls for the unit that's getting out, provided they're targeting the same target as the Scorpius Dune Rider is, kind of similar to the Razorback there. Feels like maybe with some Corpuscari Electro Priests and spammed shooting that could deliver you a pretty crazy amount of stack saves against most targets. They did have to give up their advance and drop rule for that though, so I guess there are some downsides as well. That did give them a little bit more flexibility with how far they can move, and it works quite well with Conqueror. Another vastly improved datasheet are the Castellan robots. Their gun profiles were tweaked a little bit, so the heavy phosphor blasters AP1 and damage 2, and the regular ones at AP1 and damage 1, so at least they all have a bit of AP there, and they still ignore cover. The bigger improvement comes to the Datasmith, which now seems to be pretty much auto-include for the unit when you might genuinely want to pass it up before. Now they'll start the game in the Aegis protocol, so they get toughness 10. You no longer need to roll against leadership to change the protocol from one to another, so to go into one of the more aggressive ones. And the Datasmith no longer gives the Castellan robots the infantry keyword, so it means that they can't be targeted by anti-infantry weapons and wounded super easy. I hope that the Games Workshop charge at least a relatively low amount of points for them. It'd be nice to have them as a bit more of a powerhouse of the Codex. Otherwise, for a few more quickfire changes, the Stratoraptor got damage 2 with the Phosphor Blasters, so that's quite a lot more threat for that little plane there. Dragoons with taser lances can now advance and charge, so that's a fairly enormous threat range for them. It works quite well with a few stratagem upgrades as well. The Honoured Dunecrawler got a fun force field rule for a 4+ invulnerable save to Skitarii battle line nearby. Belisarius Call's Shroud Psalm got swapped from stealth to cover, which is an interesting side grade. Stealth I think was really quite relevant, but cover is going to be quite nice with stacking things like, say, the Protector Doctriner. And finally, the Tech Priest Engineer had a side grade as well. It now grants a 5+ feel no pain to vehicles rather than a 4+ invulnerable save. I'd say for the most part that's an improvement. It means it's more relevant against low AP attacks that might be coming at you, and it is a bit more relevant for vehicles that already had an invulnerable save, like the Honoured Dunecrawler. As with the Necron Codex, points are in the book, though are redundant, and I'd guess that Games Workshop will be releasing the points later in the week. Things seem to be the same as the Space Marines and Tyranids Codex in that case, so we won't necessarily know how good each datasheet is until we've seen the tweaked points values. Things that got buffed could still wind up worse if they increased the points for them, and the same for things that got nerfed if the points got decreased. However though, just for raw datasheet changes, I feel like one issue with the Admech is going to persist no matter what Games Workshop do. Most of the more Skitarii foot troops and elite infantry type squads didn't really gain much raw power. I was hoping that Games Workshop might be a bit more lavish with upgrading stat lines or damage profiles, just to give them some more threat or durability. But for the most part, any improvements came from different options from stratagems and things, or a few of the datasheet rules that we already talked about. I still think that puts most Admech units as needing to be really quite cheap in game if Games Workshop want the units to be strong, and that's really not that great for collectors given how much the kits cost. I feel like the Codex might be a bit of a missed opportunity for just giving the individual units a bit more raw power. It also looks like, unless they change the points around in some pretty severe ways, the Kataphrons servitors are still going to be a big feature of the Codex. Still pretty much the biggest, chunkiest and most reliable shooting damage dealers you've got. A good target for any stratagems or enhancements that you can put it with tech priests with them. Lots of the other squads either can't take leaders or are very fragile. Or say with the base Skitarii troops, you could give them leaders, but then they're just quite a small, not points intensive unit where it's not quite as efficient. Again, I feel like with the Castellan rules, they could be kind of interesting. If they do go down in points a bit when the points costs come out, they could be a pretty interesting powerhouse of the Codex. Fingers crossed. Moving on though and back into new rules, one of the new detachments that I was most curious about was the Datasheet Conclave. This one seems to be Games Workshop's new reinterpretation of the Cohort Mechanicus, so the tech priests and their creations go to war. The Cohort Mechanicus is a new keyword that's handed out within the Codex, and it goes to pretty much most of the things that were in that dividing line before. All the tech priests have it, as do the Kataphrons servitors and the Electro priests, though the Castellan robots don't get it, they get Legio Cybernetica instead. The core rule for the Datasheet Conclave is Benedictions of the Omnissiah. This one's one of 2 buffs at the start of the game, and it stays all game long, so you don't get 2 flex per turn or anything like the Doctrine or Imperatives. The 2 big options that you get are either to go for extra range damage or extra melee damage. For the range damage, you've got Panegyric Procession. This one allows ranged attacks from Cohort Mechanicus units within half range to get an extra AP -1. Pretty big for any of them that can trigger it. Electro Priests would like it, both Cataphron Breachers with arc rifles or maybe Destroyers with the Grav. And then the second one is Citation in Savagery, +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge for Cohort Mechanicus keyword units on the charge. Again, that's pretty mighty. I guess you'd have strength 7 Fulgurite Electro Priests with 3 attacks each. That feels like it gets them to the point where they're genuinely quite threatening. And Breacher Melee with their hydraulic claws would be quite scary as well. I guess a few of the units do have some pretty good value with both of these, though probably at least if things stay roughly as they stood power-wise, then you might get more out of the gun one for amping up the Cataphron Breachers. Though you still have to get them really quite close, you would have to be trying to get them within rapid fire range to really get the full effect there. Otherwise, for a few supporting rules, perhaps a particularly relevant one is the Data Blessed Auto Sermon. The tech priest with that one means that their units can use the other benediction of the Omnissiah once per game for their lead units. Could be quite big for a countercharge unit, or I guess if you're going for the melee one, then a really big punch for some close range shooting. Otherwise, there's a nice Tempocopia one for fight first. That could give you a very scary breacher unit that people don't want to charge. And just for sheer fun factor, I really quite liked the Litany of the Electromancer stratagem. That's 1 command point to trigger a bunch of mortal wounds in the shooting phase. Each unit within 6 inches needs to test. If they roll a 5+, then they take D3 mortal wounds. And if the unit triggering it is an Electro Priest, it goes off on a 4+ instead. Could be kind of interesting as a last-ditch chance to kill something that only had a few wounds left if perhaps your shooting let you down. Probably a bit situational realistically, but I did think it was quite a fun image. Otherwise, for datasheet changes, there are a few added and removed datasheets. The only true new one is the Sidonian Skatros, which I did make a video about. Otherwise, there's the removal of the standard Servitor squad, which I did think was kind of likely to happen. And then the Sidonian Dragoon has been split into 2 datasheets, one with the Radium Giselle and one with the Taser Lance. For the loss of the Servitors, I don't feel like that will be felt too painfully. I guess quite a lot of Admech players out there might have converted them or had some in their collection from one part or another. I guess kind of sad to see these little units go, as they have been around in 40k for quite some time. At 50 points for the unit in game though, they weren't particularly good right now. There's quite a lot of other very cheap Admech units that would probably be worth the small upgrade compared with them. Otherwise, the Dragoon datasheet is pretty interesting. As mentioned, the Taser Lance one gets to advance and charge, and the Radium Giselle one is definitely not going to have particularly strong damage output, not when there's Iron Striders stomping around that can get a whole bunch of las cannon damage, but it should mean that it's a very cheap unit to act as an outrider, not paying more for a damage dealer lance that it's chosen not to equip. Speaking of the Skatros, his rumoured points are supposed to be around about 65 points, and he's a lone operative character with 4 wounds and a 5+ invulnerable save, and the lone operative and stealth keywords, so you can't shoot him unless you're super close. He gets the choice between 2 different sniper rifles, the Radium Giselle, similar in profile to the Sidonian Dragoon, or the Skatros Transuranic Arquebus, somewhat similar to the Rangers one. That one gets you Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage D3. The Arquebus gets you Anti-Vehicle and Monster 4+, the Radium Giselle gets you Anti-Infantry 3+, he also gets 2 reroll wound rolls against the thing that he's anti as well, so at least it means that despite only the one shot, it does wound the vast majority of the time. Unfortunately, it is a bit sad that his damage output just seems to be absolutely super weak. I think you're probably best off going for the Radium Giselle and having a chance to threaten some infantry characters. That thing is at least fairly efficient against things like standard Space Marines. The Transuranic Arquebus just isn't particularly efficient against anything whatsoever. With only damage D3, that's just not going to be any good on a 65-point model trying to shoot a tank. Overall, I probably can't see him seeing loads of play, maybe as some niche use as a secondary objective doer, or perhaps standing on a home field objective. Unless he is really quite cheap though, unless you just want to field the new Stilt Boy. You might be tempted by the extra 15 points to upgrade to a Vindicare and go from a fairly tame sniper rifle to a very high threat one. For perhaps one of the stronger looking detachments in the Codex, the Skitarii Hunter Cohort has some fun tricks. This one is the one where your more foot-based Skitarii units get stealth plus Iron Striders, and the Sicarians get cover as well. This one does seem to have a bit of a package of tricks that seem to be common in other Vanguard-style detachments in other codexes so far. There's a very nice Shroud Protocols one, which is 1 command point for this unit not being able to be targeted at greater than 12-inch range, really quite big for a unit that wants to hold down an objective, no questions asked, or just survive to deal some damage next turn. There's one to get a unit to return to strategic reserve. That could be perhaps particularly big on anything like a unit of Taraxi, jumping around the board and flaming a bunch of things with phosphor torches later in the game maybe. There's a 1 command point one for an advance and charge for a Skitarii unit, always a handy one to have in the back pocket. And a couple of fun enhancements that allow your Skitarii units to either gain infiltrators or get redeployed at the start of the game. That could be kind of interesting if you had both of those on the board. Having a Skitarii Ranger or Vanguard unit that you could maybe put somewhere useful and then redeploy to somewhere better if the opponent got first turn, that could be kind of big. On maybe a less positive note though, they do seem to have toned down the Omni Steriliser. This was pretty much the auto-include Admech relic for +3 attacks and anti-infantry 2+, which would just allow things like a Tech Priest Manipulus or maybe a Volkite Dominus to just obliterate entire swathes of enemy infantry. It seems that it is still a thing for the Rad Zone cohort, though as with a few of the enhancements it has got a rename. It's now called the Autoclavic Denunciation, which I find a bit sad just in itself really. The Omni Steriliser was quite a cool name for a relic. It still does grant the Anti-Infantry 2+ keyword and the Anti-Monster 4+, but now it no longer gives the extra 3 attacks that it had before, so that's going to be a lot less devastating wounds coming in at the enemy targets. It is sad that that won't be anywhere near as spooky for the opponent's units, though if it comes with a points decrease to something like 10 points or something, I still think it will be very usable. It does mean that you almost guarantee yourself some devastating wounds against enemy infantry, and I think that's still nice with either the Transonic Cannon or the Volkite. It is absolutely much worse though I do feel that maybe it isn't the worst change in the world. While I feel like having interesting relics like that are fun, this one was pretty much so auto-include to be perhaps one of the strongest enhancements in the entire game. Maybe a little bit too auto-include. It might just be a bit better for Admech in general if their codex was a bit more balanced, when everything is at least somewhat strong, rather than just one thing is pretty much auto-include in every single army. I guess we'll have to wait for the points to see how well they've managed that though with the other units and enhancements. Finally, besides the Rad Zone cohort and the Cybernetica cohort, which I talked about in the previous video, the last one is the Explorator Maniple, and this is the one that Games Workshop previewed. They have acquisition at any cost, nominating an acquisition objective, and then your entire army gets to reroll wound rolls of 1 against both units that are on that objective, and also if your units are standing on that objective. Means that you could nominate an enemy one with some powerful exposed units on it and just get a bit more damage, or maybe even just set up your own firebase and boost a lot of units that are spitting out some damage. The acquisition objective is quite big for a lot of the enhancements and the stratagems as well. Means that which one you choose and which other options you choose to use with it could actually be really quite big choices here. There is also a 1 command point stratagem that allows you to use a second acquisition marker as well, so you could have 2 of these active per turn, rerolling wound rolls of 1 for really quite a big chunk of your army there. Perhaps beyond that I do feel that a few of the other stratagems are at least a little bit tame, though some of them are quite usable. What I did find kind of fun though was that the Explorator Maniple enhancements get the old Holy Order names from the 8th edition Admech expansion, and again these ones are all really quite serious boosts but do require being either on or doing things with the acquisition marker. Genitor could give their unit a 4+ invulnerable save if they're on it. The Logis one can give a unit +1 to hit if they're targeting enemies that are on that acquisition marker. The Magos actually allows Admech some command point generation, generating 1 on a 4+ if they're on the marker. Feels like that one could give you a bit of a refund on the cost of buying in a second marker each turn. And I feel that actually maybe the sleeper hit as one of the strongest ones might be the Artisan. When a bear is leading a unit on the acquisition marker, once per phase you can change a hit roll, wound roll, or a saving throw to a 6. The wound roll could be quite nice on something like a Dominus Volkite Blaster, guaranteeing you 1 devastating wound each turn, though it could just be good for powerful guns out of the unit. And the change a saving throw to a 6 is pretty much guaranteed value, provided you're on that point. That's wounds that you definitely would be taking that you've just avoided, and that could be a really big shot like say a melter or a las cannon shot or something. Overall it does seem fun. This one does feel like it might be a bit of a mind game though with which acquisition markers you use. The opponent's probably going to find that the Admech are really going to be very possessive over the objective markers on this one and just stick to them like an electromagnet. Overall I think there's definitely been a fair bit of extra interest added to the Codex, though I'm maybe a little bit disappointed to see that they didn't go a little bit braver with datasheet changes, though I guess for overall army strength we'll have to wait until the points cost come out to really try and gauge that. As I said, hopefully I'll be back for the full Admech Codex review sometime within the next 24 hours or so feel free to stay tuned for that if you'd like to see more. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. And if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.